This is Apotheosis, the official podcast of the Production Designers Collective. I'm your host, Alexander Whittenberg. Thanks for tuning in to the third episode of our ongoing sub-series, Notes from the Field. Today, we're joined by production designer Chris Trujillo, whose credits include Echo, Glass, and all 5 seasons of Stranger Things, which we're here to chat about today. For those of you who are not fully caught up on the latest season of Stranger Things and are hoping to avoid spoilers, I suggest you revisit this episode once you've had a chance to complete the series. Please note that due to the demanding schedules of those in our industry, these conversations are recorded in a nomadic and remote space, which may lead to inconsistencies in quality, but we'll always do our best to deliver a great listening experience. If you've been enjoying Apotheosis, please consider taking a moment to rate the podcast and share with those who might also enjoy the program. The conversation you're about to hear was recorded last week, and I started our chat the way I always do, by asking Chris to share his thoughts on what creativity means to him.
I'm sure there's a myriad of brilliant quotes that answer that question. But I mean, for me, I guess it's, observing the world and internalizing it and then sort of, processing it and then refracting it, reflecting it back out through your own weird lens, I guess. Yeah, I mean, that's a bit of a grandiose response. But yeah, I think it's just, how do you interpret and then kind of express the world as you see it, maybe? Something along those lines. I mean, it's also just applying your intelligence to something, new and interesting and ideally fun, I suppose. I mean, for me, I feel very, creativity for me, and very lucky is kind of my bread and butter. It's great.
No, it's what a thrill to get to be creative professionally every day. I woke up this morning and watched the final episode of season 5 of Stranger Things. And it's really interesting. Your answer to that question was striking to me because you mentioned kind of reflecting back what we observe in the world or refracting it and kind of exploring it in the storytelling lens. And that's kind of the big takeaway for me for this final moment of Stranger Things is the power of storytelling. And when I think about fantasy and imagination and these kind of imagined worlds, it is all about holding a mirror to our own relatable lived human experiences, I think. And I find that really powerful about Stranger Things, and I want to get into that. But let's go back to the beginning, because you've been with this show for 10 years. So how did Stranger Things first enter your life?
The very literal way that it happened was I was designing at the time. I was just kind of clawing my way into the indie design world. And I worked with a woman named Lee Janiak. We made a little movie called Honeymoon. We had a great creative relationship. We got on really well. And she was a partner of somebody named Ross Duffer. And I met those guys then, and just, we got along. And then a few years later, I was in Los Angeles making a slightly bigger, though still very small indie movie. And Lee and I had a lunch, and Ross, and I think Matt was there as well even. And we were just chatting, and they started to tell me about this project that was just a glimmer in their eye. It had no specific title even. If it did, I think it was Montauk at that point. And they just kind of basically pitched me Stranger Things, it was slightly different. There were some of the details, but the sort of the thrust of it was exactly what it ended up being. So I, of course, as a young, excited production designer, was like, that's exactly a project that I would kill for. So, we talked about it over lunch, and I was like, look, if ever this thing gets legs, I would love a shot at discussing it with you and kind of pitching you my ideas for it. And then, we went away and assumed like, well, that probably nothing will ever come of that. That idea is like, the likelihood of it getting made is very slim. And then it just so happened that I think within a year and a half or so, I was actually, fortunately, I was doing my first slightly larger project in New York. Um, and I got a call from those guys and they were like, look, this is looking like it might actually happen. Netflix is really interested and it looks like we're going to go into pre-production here. Would you still be interested? And I, of course, was like, yes. And I immediately kind of slacked off in my duties on that job that I was on. And I started putting together the lookbook that I had kind of always been imagining in my mind ever since that kind of first conversation with them. So yeah, I put that book together. And I sent it to them, and I think we were just instantly on the same page. So much so that I think before they were even able to hire me, they were like printing the lookbook out as a sort of point of reference, I think, as they were writing it and stuff. And then it was just the kind of the logistical hurdles, me being a relatively unknown, like indie New York production designer. They, bless them, they were like willing to go to bat for me. And they gave my name as somebody who they really were interested in working with to production. And then it was just sort of a painstaking process of me kind of meeting the necessary folks and like, my references were checked and it was, you know, I was somewhat reluctantly hired. I think everyone was kind of like, okay, like the Duffers have faith in this guy, let's give it a try.
Yeah.
And that was kind of how it all went down. And then it was like, okay, anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, but so yeah, it was over a period of years. It went from being this, oh, that is like too impossibly interesting and unlikely to like, oh, hey, this thing is actually happening. It was very lucky.
Well, it's funny because I've been reading these, articles that have been coming out about how hard it was for the Duffers to get this show, to go. And it's, at its core, it seems like such an appealing property that really taps into that like Amblin Americana nostalgia piece that is so like enticing and really like touches the zeitgeist in a really exciting way. So it's always funny to me to know like how hard it was to even just get it going.
Yeah, no, it's funny. Like in retrospect, it feels like, wow, like anyone would be a fool to have turned down the opportunity to produce the show, or you know what I mean. But I think at the time it was like, and I think people were rightly unsure because you've got a script that essentially revolves around a handful of children. So you're working with minors, and it is pretty sensitive stuff. It's like it is scary. So I think I've heard the Duffers say like, one of the obstacles was, people read it and felt like, well, so you want to make a show with children that's not specifically for children. And I don't think that there are very few sort of analogs to that. And I think it was just, and also, the Duffer brothers, I mean, they're incredibly charismatic. And like, as soon as you meet them, you know that these guys have something special going on, but they were like relative unknowns. I mean, to be able to get financing for, an entire season of a really, even that first season was relatively very ambitious. So I feel like it was sort of, Netflix was going out on a limb to some extent. They were kind of placing their faith in a bunch of kind of creative upstarts, and it just worked out really nicely. At the time, I think Netflix was the perfect home for it, and they had the sort of appetite to take a chance and do something different. And it just really, but yeah, to hear the Duffers tell it, it was like they were kind of going around town, like trying to get interest. And it was not an easy process. Yeah. They got a lot of no's before they got a yes.
It's determination, wins the day. I want to talk practically briefly because I relate to this kind of indie world that I know you kind of came up in. So jumping from these indie features and projects onto this larger, series that I'm sure none of you could have had any idea what it eventually became. But in the moment, kind of what was that shift like to go from the indie world where you're probably a department of just a few people doing many, many things to now coming into this into this new world where you have a whole team of art department that just grew season after season. Like, what was that shift like for you?
Well, I mean, I think the nice thing about season one was that it was a gentler transition, out of what I had been doing. And frankly, I think the indie world there's no better boot camp. Nothing makes you better sort of connected to the whole process of I think both filmmaking, but it's art department specifically, like having had to kind of
Agreed.
having had to wear all of the hats, on so many tiny projects and really doing it, just for like the love of doing it. And I spent so many years just really excited that I had found this avenue of, that this is a job, and I may actually see a path forward, to making this a viable career. I was already like just really excited to be moving, however slowly, in the direction of being a production designer. And I think part of why everything worked so nicely and why that first season was really it just really hit and everything kind of lined up is that we all were coming from our everyone was still kind of like dreaming of like making it, so but what we were trying to do was essentially kind of maintain the integrity of what we had been doing in all of these smaller projects where you're going in there and you're investing yourself 100% and you're kind of, so I think that first season, I mean, we had obviously expanded resources from anything I'd ever done before. And I was fairly new to television, which is a slightly different process logistically and kind of the way all that works. But ultimately, and I think part of why we were successful was I didn't really approach it any differently creatively and in terms of the collaboration in the conceiving of all that stuff. And the first season was, it was a more intimate scale. So it really wasn't unfamiliar. It was these sort of, domestic spaces and this more kind of like quotidian side of Hawkins' life. So it was it was a comfortable first step into this like ever expanding world of Stranger Things,
Yeah, that makes sense. And I agree with your sentiment that I think indie filmmaking is the best boot camp anybody can have. Even just making movies with your friends, before going into like even actually, having a crew and creating a feature. I think there's nothing better than just pulling out a camera and going in your backyard and imagining.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's literally kind of where the Duffer Brothers came from as filmmakers, was like just, making little movies together since they're kids, so they brought that sort of like, genuine enthusiasm and sort of excitement to be doing what we were doing into the process. And I think it definitely shows.
So with Hawkins, definitely feels like a town that you kind of have known your whole life, that kind of any town Americana. How did you decide with the Duffer Brothers what town this wanted to be, like what the spirit of this town was, and how did you eventually land on Atlanta?
I mean, it was a bit of a process actually, because as I think is pretty well known now, like the initial concept was Montauk, and it was set in eastern coastal Long Island essentially, and it was I think it was partly because it was inspired by Jaws, by Amity, right? Like they liked this coastal idea, so we started out looking for that. Like my first task once I was on board was to kind of to go to a few different spots and explore them and see how viable or not they were for filming. So like I went to North Carolina, we explored Long Island, and then we obviously Atlanta was this kind of burgeoning film scene and there were resources there. So we went to Atlanta, and I just happened to have my set decorator, who I had made a couple of indie films with, Jess Royal, was an Atlanta local. So she also, I kind of contacted her. I was like, hey, I'm coming to town. Well, I'm scouting for this new show. We're going to see if Atlanta is a fit. So she put us together with Tony Holly, who was our location manager, and he just kind of took me out. He gave him a rough pitch of the show. It was like, this is kind of the general vibe of the world. He took me out and showed me like all these different iterations of kind of suburban America as it exists in kind of the greater Atlanta area. And I brought all of that information and made lookbooks out of like everything I had seen from all these various places that we had been scouting. And it just kind of occurred to everybody like, hey, like, why are we fighting? Like, why are we fighting to make this, coastal and to be almost overly specific in the nature of the town when there's all of these time capsule suburban environments, and we can actually lean into this anywhere USA, which is ultimately going to make the world of Hawkins, that much more broadly accessible to the average, American person. So that was kind of a turning point in the scouting process and the location process. And it really did end up influencing kind of in a big way, like what the tone of the show and the environment of the show ended up being. And and in Atlanta it really paid off. I mean, the crew base was amazing. And just the variety of options for locations, it kind of, Atlanta always provided what we were looking for ultimately. So, that was kind of it. And the whole conceptually, I think things kind of took a turn once we made that decision of like, oh, let's lean into anywhere USA. And it ended up really working out, I think.
Yeah, that's great. I actually live in Midtown Atlanta.
I was living in Inman Park for, on and off for 10 years, but we had relocated there like permanently for the last 5 years. And I just now moved back to New York finally.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, Inman Park is great. I got to ask quickly, what is your favorite coffee shop and restaurant?
Gosh, I love Kimball House, which is, I think, the obvious, I'm a bourgeois hipster. I love Kimball House, but it is really remarkably consistently excellent. And that like oyster program is off the chain, but there's so many good restaurants. I mean, Atlanta is like so much more cosmopolitan than anybody fully understands. I feel like, oftentimes people will be like, oh, I'm going to do a show in Atlanta. Like, how do you feel about it? And I always like, I rhapsodize about Atlanta. But yeah, as far as coffee shops, I often went to Little Tart. It was just because they honestly have some of the best croissants that you can get like in the world. And that kind of I became buddies with those folks. So I always ended up going to Little Tart usually.
Well, those are two of my favorite spots. So I'm happy that we're on the same page. The oysters at Kimball House and the cocktails and the lattes and croissants at Little Tart. It's nice to have a moment of love for Atlanta because Atlanta, you're right, Atlanta often gets a bad rap. Jumping back into Hawkins, there's something about this show and your design that, and I've heard you speak about this before, this lived-in quality that is so well accomplished in Stranger Things. And I know that can be a tricky line to ride where it's real, but it also has a bit of that kind of cinematic romanticism, but not too much. So how do you strike that balance?
I mean, I've always been I always have tried to ground from the very first tiniest projects. I'm most interested in sort of grounding everything in a realism and in a sort of at most essential, I think, is like being very specific to character. And, I think, and I've said this before in other formats, but like, for me, the place where I'm best able to contribute to storytelling and to character development is in the sets, and specifically the domestic sets. And, I think for me, I always want to believe the environments. I mean, because, we're making this show. It's very stylized. You've got this kind of like supernatural, fantastical elements and very overt reference to very magical, like filmmaking. And we're creating this world that's kind of oftentimes fantastical or at the very least supernatural. So, and it just becomes really important to me. And doing a period show, especially, I feel like there's a lot of potential pitfalls in making an 80s show. I mean, it's very easy to pull something that is just overtly screams 1980s. And I feel like the goal for me has always been to not be distracting in the production design. Like I don't want an audience to get preoccupied with like that overtly 80s element. I'm more interested in them seeing sort of the life layer and the details of a given character's environment, so that I feel like I'm able to provide a gravity, and a realism to the overall world, like that I think adds dimension to what could feel sort of design for design's sake, or like
Mm-hmm.
we're I don't know. Yeah, I try and let the camera and the script do all of the fantastical stuff, and I'm trying to create a very grounded world for all of that to take place within.
I mean, it's like even in the fantasy world or the supernatural world, I mean, of which there are so many layers now, especially in season 5. Um, there is a certain groundedness to it all. I mean, to jump ahead even to the Pain Tree, which is an astonishing set that is so kind of, I mean, it's part of the fabric of the show, but it's a new world that we haven't seen before, and it's rooted in kind of this nature. I mean, it's a tree, like, so even in that sense, there is a sort of groundedness to it. Can you speak to kind of like how you arrived at this idea, well, with the Duffers, of like the actual tree taking on the form of a tree with this kind of deeper layer of Vecna's lair?
I think there's a number of things we need this really epic, satisfying sort of big bad, right? And it was also going to be an opportunity to physically, like, to embody the mind flare, right? It's been this kind of like this cloud, this ominous cloud of particles that have shape but are like, it's sort of something ephemeral about it. And then we've had all of these, the Demogorgons and the Vecna, sort of, these physical creatures. So it became important to figure out how do we embody the mind flare, and how do we do it at this scale. And for me, it was really important that if we're gonna approach this essentially giant creature, I really want to approach it from a, let's ground it in something biological. So it became this process of what is the surface texture of all of this, and we realized we wanted it to feel very truly alive and sort of unsettlingly like meaty and organic, and it wanted to have sort of a living surface texture. So I mean, that for me this season, one of the big evolutions in the art department this season was that we had a really expanded sculptural department run by Alex Sherrod, who was excellent. I mean, they carved all of the caves. They carved, just an unbelievable amount of stuff. The Melty Lab, all of that was new. All of these big, large scale, like organic set pieces. And then I think sort of the apex of that experience for the art department this season was creating the interior of the Pain Tree. So yeah, but as ever with every other set, it was about like, how do we make this like absolutely enormous, fantastical, supernatural monster? How do we make it into architecture, essentially? How do we create a physical set that, does what it needs to do structurally, but also feels like living tissue,
Yeah, yeah. Well, meaty and organic are are two great words to describe that space. What did you look at? Like, what were you looking at in terms of research to kind of figure out the biology of that space?
I mean, a lot of really unpleasant imagery of dissections, of flayed bodies. I mean, you name it, we looked at it. It was, and I actually am a bit squeamish about all that stuff too. So for me, it was very difficult. But we just did so much art, we did so much R&D, and there was just a lot of material process kind of. I mean, I can't even tell you how many different materials our scenic department, our sculpture department played with to kind of arrive at those believable organic surface textures. But I would be remiss to not acknowledge Michael Marr, who has been with the show designing concepts for a very long time. He's like the kind of head concept and creature designer And he's kind of an essential part of the visual effects department. He drew the initial he drew all the concept work for the mind flay or for the pain tree. So it was about kind of, part of the process was really working with him and kind of dialing in the concept, and then we kind of work from there. He and the Duffers, and then ultimately me, we got involved to kind of make it physical.
It's brilliant work all around. Bravo to the whole team. I know we jump around in so many different horror genres throughout the show, and so many kind of aesthetics. I have to say, one of the most striking visual worlds we explore is the sort of inner world of 11, this black void that we go to, starting in, I think, season 1. So how did you all arrive at such a kind of stark and striking space that is her inner world?
It was a long process. It was a lot of conversation went into figuring out what that was going to be, and we played with all kinds of different ideas. I mean, there was like the more sort of atmospheric version where there would be more texture in the air, and it would feel more like maybe a misty sort of void type of space. And it could have been any color. We just discussed so many different variations on what that psychic space might want to look like, and then we realized, like, why, maybe minimalism, maybe something simple and like a literal void is the best approach. And we played obviously around with the idea of just doing a totally like liminal all black space. And then I don't know, we started to think about having some sort of reflective elements, and then that kind of led to the idea of, well, water is a reflecting pool is a great way to get a really large reflective surface that you can physically move around in. And it's funny because we were conceiving of it, and we were already kind of down this path, and then I saw the Jonathan Glazer movie Under the Skin, and I was like, God, that is literally what we've been talking about. So, I have to give props to them for sort of like, giving me ultimately the confidence to be like, yes, this is a direction to go in. And then it was, and also it's one of those things. It was us also adapting to, our resources, which were relatively limited season 1, so we wanted to do something that could be shot practically and that wouldn't need a visual effects extension. And we were able to do that with this approach. I mean, we just created essentially a black box with a 2-inch deep reflecting pool, and everything can be done in camera. I mean, that's not to say that visual effects, they would probably roll their eyes and grit their teeth hearing me say that, because of course there is work to do sometimes, like removing stray reflections. They do a lot of cleanup that is essential to making it all work. But mostly everything is in camera. And that was throughout the season was kind of part of our ethos in terms of our creative approach, was like, everything we can get in camera, let's get in camera. But especially season 1, when it was essential for us to be able to kind of to make what we wanted to make with the resources we had. So yeah, it was a nice kind of confluence of creativity and necessity, just working out really nicely.
It worked out really nicely. Now, on the topic of the buyer's house and the domestic spaces in general, we follow these domestic spaces through 5 seasons. Obviously, they evolve over time subtly as the characters grow. So how did you kind of make subtle adjustments to all of these houses from season to season to help us kind of grow along with the characters?
It was really just a matter of always being mindful and tracking sort of course, firstly, like, where are we in the story? Like, what's happening? What's everyone been through? Like, what is a given set? What's happened in a given set? Because we always want to reflect the aftermath as, accurately. So, if you're paying attention, you see that, like, well, that section of the cabin is boarded up and looks different than it might have before a monster attack. So we always try and leave those traces of the action that's taken place in a given set. And then, of course, we're tracking the year, right? So season to season, we're jumping 6 months or a year, or in the case of this most recent season, a couple of years. So we always, in terms of the product, the pop cultural elements in any given set, we're always trying to be careful about, well, what would be the appropriate, poster or product that whatever it is, we try and be faithful to the period with that kind of stuff. And then more than anything, it's really just keeping track of like, how are these characters evolving? What's happened to Will? What's happened to Jonathan? What age are they? And just making sure that like we're reflecting, what how their interests might have changed slightly, like what they've been up to. Like Will's drawing has undoubtedly improved, so any drawings that Will has made will make new ones, and you're seeing these kinds of like little details that you may or may not even come into focus in the background, but we're always trying to kind of tell that story with like a Hopper's Cabin type set. It served a certain purpose season 2, and then as it becomes a more permanent home for Hop and 11, et cetera, and we've added a room that is Hopper's room now. These kinds of things. The sets tend to evolve that way as well, obviously. And then sometimes they're evolving like within the context of the season, like the Buyer's House seasons 1 and 2, where it goes from, working class home to like this total nightmare festooned with Christmas lights and axe chopped holes in the walls and these kinds of things. And then there's also with our show in particular, we've got to keep track. Like we have to kind of reiterate our sets into the Upside Down oftentimes. So the Wheeler House, actually, that one's the Wheeler House because Karen is a little bit more inclined to keep up with the Joneses. The elements of dressing in her house changed a little more. We're seeing like maybe there's a new wallpaper, maybe there's new pieces of furniture because, despite everything that's going on, she's still, buying a new piece of furniture or, changing some lighting fixtures.
I want to ask about netherizing. This is a term that I've heard you refer to, which I believe is kind of the process of flipping one of these spaces into the Upside Down.
Yeah, I mean, that was another one that from the very beginning, kind of that was being conceived of concurrently with like 11's Void and stuff. And again, it was, like we knew that we wanted to approach it practically. And in terms of just conceptualizing it, it was very difficult to figure out a physical approach to it because the idea for it was easy to talk about. We were like, oh yeah, it's this kind of dark reflection of our world, and it's infected and it's murky, and those are like easy things to say. And there's organic growth on everything, so everyone was kind of on the same page, intellectually about what it should be. But then it was like, okay, well, how do we actually physically do that, and how do we do it in a way that we can like practically achieve in the time that we have, et cetera. So that turned into experimenting with different materials. And then it was like, well, we need to figure out a way to kind of mass manufacture vinage and what we call like the veil. This is like a little, that kind of, clear, membrane-y, like looks like net, like plastic netting almost.
Yeah.
Anyway, so, we kind of had a version of it season 1. It worked for us. And then we kind of over the seasons, as the scope of what we needed to netherize increased dramatically, we kind of got to a point where we had like an assembly line. It was like a special effects factory just cranking out this stuff. I mean, it's wild. And then we realized that where, anytime we were like in an interior where we could determine pretty specifically the amount of area that needed to be interacted with, then we were like, we're going to approach this physically and we're going to install these nether vines. So, the process really didn't change other than the materials got a little more specific and sophisticated, and our approach and our sort of ability to do it at scale and relatively fast improved. But for the most part, the physical approach to it was, was the same. It just kind of like everything in the show scaled up. And I feel like, that's kind of quintessential Stranger Things is like the heart of the thing hasn't changed at all, but it's just like the circumstances have, grown exponentially. One of the big struggles was the spores because we knew that we wanted that sort of atmospheric murk. So that was, we had varying degrees of success with using practical, fluff that would be floated in the air.
Yeah.
Sometimes it worked beautifully, sometimes it didn't, but yeah.
I love that. I think we need to take a moment for the vines because I know this has been talked about time and time again, but it's my understanding that you've done like 100 miles of vines. Is that something like that?
Yeah. Like that would not be an exaggeration. I think I may have overstated it at other points where I'm like, oh, it was hundreds of miles of vines, which maybe not hundreds of miles, but maybe 100 miles. I mean, if you saw the physical space that contained it was an unbelievable. And when you get in, there's the really large vines and then they get smaller and there's the really thin ones that are almost like whip thin, Yeah. So I think if you're including all of those vines, I have no doubt that we got into like 100 miles of vines kind of thing. But yeah, it was kind of fun. It became kind of this running joke about we were like single-handedly keeping the pool noodle industry in business, whilst also making them inaccessible to like everybody else because we had the market cornered on like all of these specific materials.
It's the pink paint Barbie situation, right?
Yes, exactly. But no, it was fun. And I got to say, like, I'm super happy with what we were able to achieve practically with the nether and with the vinage and all that. But it really, the places where it really is perfect to me, like on screen, on camera, are the scenes where visual effects really gets in there and adds that final layer of undulation. And they add a really nice detail layer. So, I'm really happy with what we accomplished practically, but I would be remiss not to shout out the visual effects department because ultimately the greatest success that we ever have with that stuff, I think is when that visual effects, icing is put on the cake,
For sure. And this show was a perfect marriage of those two worlds. Did you ever feel like you were time traveling back into your own lived experiences working on this show with some of the details? Or like Starcourt Mall comes to mind of being surrounded by this like very believable 1980s mall that you all painstakingly created.
I mean, the whole show, I was born in 81 and I was a very present like child. I've always been very like engaged with like things and environments. So I remember and that's part of why I think when they initially pitched me the show, I was so thrilled because I really could see, I could see it kind of through the lens of my own childhood. And so it made it, it's almost easier as a designer when you've actually kind of lived through the era you're trying to recreate. So yeah, I kind of, it allowed me to kind of create an idealized version, I think, of what I might have, hoped for as a kid. Like I grew up in Florida, so we never had a basement, but I like, fetishized basements. And again, like all these great movies of like the 70s and 80s that we reference, oftentimes there are these kind of the hangout that the kids have, whether it's a basement or a tree house or, whatever. So I always, in my mind, that was like this just ideal space. So yeah, it was really fun. I definitely got to like, appease my my inner child and like kind of create the space I would have like dreamed of hanging out in as a kid,
Absolutely.
And then the mall, and malls were still very proud. I worked at the mall. I worked at 2 malls. In fact, I worked at Burdines in my early teen years. So I was very familiar with that mall. And then I worked at a candy shop in the center of a very bustling mall in like the late 90s. And really it hadn't changed. The superficial aesthetics had changed somewhat by the middle late 90s, but the whole vibe of a mall is like very much baked into my sort of adolescence, and my like, my first jobs as a teenager were at malls. So yeah, it was really fun for me to create that environment that was so kind of dear to me, to my kind of adolescent and teenage self.
Absolutely. Yeah. Where in Florida did you grow up, by the way?
Tampa, Florida.
Me too.
You did?
I grew up in St. Petersburg.
It's awesome. I was just there Thanksgiving. Yeah, man. I grew up in Tampa, and I grew up in suburban Tampa, which is, and again, I think the reason why the show has such resonance, like, with all Americans, is that, like, I, apart from the water table not allowing basements in Tampa, Florida, like, my suburban experience was aesthetically very similar to what we're creating in Hawkins,
Looking across all 5 seasons, I'm curious what visual ideas stayed surprisingly consistent and what kind of changed the most.
I feel like we really were able to maintain a continuity of just color, tone, and texture generally. I mean, from the earliest lookbooks, from those first sets we built, we had a color palette. We knew what we wanted it to feel like, and lighting quality really also, I think, is what's kind of like helped maintain this cohesiveness visually. We were always, one thing that we always approach very carefully and thoughtfully in collaboration with the cinematographer, is the lighting, is practical lighting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really allowed us to keep a kind of tone and a environmental quality that's very consistent, I think, from, across all of the seasons. And again, like, just our fidelity to sort of period detail, and to, like, just the lived in reality of a given set, whether it's whether it's a domestic interior or a police station, or, the bowels of Hawkins Lab, there's the same, our approach and our standards are the same in terms of what the aging wants to be, what the how kind of texturally specific we are with the fact that they all want to feel like spaces that exist and that are lived in and that are rubbed up against and worn out. And, so I think we actually managed to achieve that. And even when we got into these kind of grander sets, like the Creel House and as the world got bigger, and even when we expanded out to the Southern California suburban world of season 4, or the underground silo, the approach is always like realism first, and then we build on that, and I've got to say, I think I was very lucky to be able to maintain a continuity of my crew. Like, Jess was with me from day one. Our construction department, our paint department, Mike Wheeler, Randy Woodward, those guys were with me from season 1. Sean Brennan, my supervising art director, had been a collaborator of mine, again from the indie days, and he was able to come season 2, and we were just able to really maintain a kind of creative core in the art department that I think, we all kind of reinforced each other's intentions, and we were always we're like a check and balance for one another, so that, having all been invested in it for so long, we were able to provide that sort of, the continuity, of creative personnel really allowed us to pretty naturally maintain, a sort of aesthetic continuity.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. What did you learn about yourself as an artist that you didn't know when you started this show?
I think more than anything, more than anything, I think I learned a capacity to collaborate very broadly and across departments. I mean, interdepartmentally, but interdepartmentally as well. Like, that was, I think my capacity to work with so many other people and to learn how to do that, with less ego, and with, to that we're all kind of working together on this thing, and we're all going to kind of bring our A game. I think that was the biggest development for me. I mean, I was like I started out as like kind of fake it till you make it, always feeling like an imposter. And like, I think over the course of this show, my sense of like, oh, this is like, this is what I want to do. This is what I'm kind of meant to do. Like that really kind of solidified in large part because of this experience I've had on Stranger Things. But I think more than anything, the greatest like takeaway from it all has been this kind of newfound ability to really understand, to communicate with, and to sort of collaborate with all of these other specialists, all of these
Mm-hmm.
people who bring so much and such specific skill sets to the table, to learn how to like to interact with those people and to all kind of like create something, to organize the chaos in a way that like, we're able to achieve these gigantic things.
So, after living in Stranger Things for a decade, what was the hardest part to let go of for you?
Truthfully, creatively, I think we really all were able to see this thing through. Like there was that, I feel very like that finale, I actually only just watched it about a week or so ago. I was like waiting to watch it. And I have to say, I'm super proud of what we did. I feel like, oh, that is the ending that we were building towards, since the first episode 10 years ago. So I couldn't be more satisfied creatively. So it actually is not as hard as I thought it would be to kind of walk away from the creative project, because
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it reached its fruition and everybody just, we delivered what we hoped to deliver. But
Yeah.
for me, I think what I most miss is that just weird creative family of misfits. I mean, it's very
Yeah.
seldom you get to know people and work with people and become such close friends with the people that you're working with for such a long period of time. I think the
Mm-hmm.
hardest thing for me um, is to just have to kind of leave that creative family, and of course, we'll all work together in different configurations and iterations again in the future. But yeah, I think that is, and I suspect that is probably the case for most of the folks that,
Yeah.
especially the ones who, were in it from the beginning. Like that's the kind of the hardest part to walk away from is just that sort of familiarity and that familial sort of creative environment.
I love it. And it shows on the screen. You really can feel it, You can feel that kind of care, the care and the detail that was put into this show. That's from a group of people who really uh, love to work with each other and love to collaborate to make something really sensational. Now that you moved on from the show, how do you stay inspired between projects? Like, what is it that keeps you going creatively?
I mean, honestly, I'm excited to work on any project that is like entertaining on the page with like interesting people involved. I'm like equally excited. So like I just wrapped up a show here in New York. First show I've done in New York in a very long time, and yeah, I mean it's the same thing. It's like reading the scripts and like the process of figuring out who these characters are, what these environments are, like that like the joy of that hasn't diminished at all. I mean, it's whether it's in the fantastical and now very familiar world of Stranger Things, or in a more contemporary urban thriller. Like for me, you know, the fun is being able to sit down with a script and read it and internalize it and interpret it, and then be able to start putting together visual ideas and sharing them with the director and sharing them with the cinematographer. And like, I mean, that process and the prospect of it, I mean, I honestly can't imagine doing anything else anymore. Yeah, that's it. I mean, the opportunity to like create a new world, a new environment, whether it's like, exceedingly mundane or like, totally wild and outlandish. It's that process for me that's like really keeps me feeling very lucky to be doing this.
Yeah, I love that. I want to ask you one more thing. I have noticed on your website and also on a hat that you've worn before this phrase, "We are all sensitive people." And I just want to know a little bit more about what that is.
I mean, well, it's literally a quote from a Marvin Gaye song, right? But I don't know why. It's just something that I always loved that line, and it was just something I kind of would say, and then I kind of became part of like little drawings that I would do. I would draw these characters saying it, and then it turned into just like I remember like in my very brief and very like the occasional tag I would do, like I would do a little, we are all sensitive people. I remember doing it in big tape letters on the side of a production vehicle on some tiny indie movie. And it just kind of became this running thing for me. And ultimately I think it is, I mean, it's part of my like ethos. I think it's an inherently true statement. I think it's like very broadly applicable and very, very human. And I like too that you can be kind of as, in the way that you interpret it, you can be kind of as earnest or as cynical as you want, and it still is meaningful.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, just depending on the mood I'm in, it's just something that's just very true to me. It's like something I find fundamentally true, and I just think it's a nice thing for people to like remind themselves of too. I mean, it's given the kind of desperate and stressful state of the world, I kind of wish everyone would stop and realize that we are all sensitive people and kind of behave accordingly,
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's just been like a little phrase that's always meant something to me. And I've kind of carried it with me as like a little, I don't know, a little mantra or something.
Well, it stands out to me too. I think it's a really beautiful, mindset, ethos, philosophy, whatever you want to call it. And it corresponds with the energy you put out into the world. So thank you for sharing your art with the world. I mean, it's great stuff.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's incredible. It's very gratifying. I feel like, so lucky to have been able to like, be a part of the journey and to have like actually, made something that people really engage with and relate to and, find solace in. Entertainment is great. It's been awesome.
I love that. Well, I'm going to go get a latte and croissant at Little Tart now in your honor. So.
Oh, I envy you, man. I have not been able to find a comparable. I have not yet found a comparable croissant in Brooklyn, which is crazy to me. But I gotta.
That's high praise. That is high praise.
Yeah.
That brings us to the end of our conversation today. I'd like to give a shout out to my co-producer, Gavin Mosier, and the composer of our original music, Nathan Avakian. As a reminder, if you enjoyed today's program, please consider taking a moment to rate the podcast and subscribe for upcoming episodes. Until next time, stay creative, and thanks for listening.